Hello everybody, my name's Zahir and I want to welcome you all to my channel Plants and Paint. So for those of you who are new to my channel, generally what I do here is I pick an individual plant and I do a care and maintenance video for that actual plant. For those of you who are returning, thank you for your continued support. Thank you for all the support I've been receiving recently on my YouTube channel and my Instagram channel. And I'm going to get started, and today we're going to be talking about the Anthurium Warocqueanum. Now, I hope I've said that correctly, also known as the Queen Anthurium, but I'm going to refer to it by its scientific name, which is the Anthurium Warocqueanum. So this particular plant was actually quite difficult to research because, as I'm sure those of you who are here to find information on this plant, you'll actually know that online there's not much information about this particular plant at all. So what I've actually done is I've researched its natural growing environment, which is the rainforests of Colombia. So I've done a bit of research into the environment within that rainforest and the type of plant that it is and how it grows. And then I've based a lot of my research on that, because I'm sure as some of you will know who are here because of care and maintenance requirements, you'll know that there's not actually much information about this particular plant online. So I will talk in quite a bit of detail about the individual things that I'm recommending to you, more or less explaining the reasons as to why I recommend that you do it that particular way, because most of this video is actually based on my own research. Okay, so firstly what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the plant itself. So Anthurium warocqueanum, which is commonly known as the Queen Anthurium, is a species of plant in the genus Anthurium. The plant can be found growing natively in the rainforests of Colombia. So the Warocqueanum is an epiphytic plant, which means that it's a plant which grows upon another plant, and most commonly can be found growing attached to trees in the moist rainforests where it can be found natively. And it grows using its roots as anchor points. So just to quickly go back over that, it's from the rainforests of Colombia. It's an epiphyte. And what that actually means is that it's a plant which grows upon another plant. So you'll generally find this in nature in amongst the branches and the trunks of trees heading up towards the canopies. So you'll never find it. It's not the kind of plant that you're going to find growing on the ground. You're actually going to have to look up to find this. So that's my general introduction to the plant. If there is anything more that you want to know, I'm more than happy to do a bit of further research into it. But what we're actually going to do now is we're going to start talking about the care and maintenance for this plant. So what we're going to do, we're going to start off with the lighting requirements. So the Anthurium warocqueanum, as you can imagine, based on its native growing environment, its growing conditions actually will require medium to low lighting conditions, because as I mentioned earlier, it generally will be found underneath a canopy. It will be attached to the trunk or branches of trees, so it's not going to be in any way in any direct sunlight. So I would imagine, based on that and looking at a few videos that I did find online where you are able to actually view it in its native environment, it is generally under quite a bit of shade. Although there is light getting in, it's very dappled light, it's very filtered light. So therefore in the hobby, I would suggest that you try and replicate medium to low indirect light, and I'm assuming based on its natural growing environment that it will actually do best in that situation. Although You can give it bright indirect light, but do monitor. If you don't have the option to give it medium to low and you have to give it bright indirect light, do monitor how it is reacting to that, because the last thing you want is to start burning the leaves, which in turn will injure the plant, and you'll end up with just a stump with no leaves, and really you don't want that. So that's the lighting conditions. What we're going to do now is we're going to talk about potting mix. Now, this is the place where I actually struggled the most to find any information whatsoever online concerning what kind of potting mixes will be the best sort of potting mixes. So as there isn't much information on the internet concerning care and maintenance of the plant in question, I've based my potting mix information that I've gathered from its natural environment as well as people's accounts on their methods and their approach. So before the first thing I considered was, due to it being an epiphyte, that it would have a very aerated potting mix due to the roots being generally exposed to the environment. So the fact that it's a rainforest plant means that it needs a moist environment, quite a warm environment, but due to the roots growing attached to trees, it will never be waterlogged or in a soggy environment. So before I go on to my recommendation for the potting mix that I would suggest, I've actually noticed a lot of people online, they use just sphagnum moss for their potting mix. Now there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and I can imagine the plants will do generally fine in there, but the idea of my channel is to try and replicate as closely as possible the environments that they're living in, and to give you the care and maintenance requirements based on that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to recommend something a little bit different, which I have actually grown my Warocqueanums in since I first started purchasing them, and I've had no adverse effects from it. Although I have used sphagnum moss as a single growing medium in certain circumstances, so I will go into that after I give you the information about the potting medium that I suggest. So when purchasing a juvenile Warocqueanum, generally you're going to get them as cuttings, so you're not going to get much roots on them, and they're not plants that ship very well. So I would suggest, you know, 30 to 40% of the time they may be turning up to you with a certain amount of damage on. Like on these leaves, you can almost see some cold burns on these two here, but that would be due to the shipping, because I did see pictures of them before they were shipped to me and they looked absolutely perfect, and when they arrived they did have these marks on the leaves, which suggest the drop in temperature was quite extreme for them. So the potting medium that I think is a good place to start would be a mixture of good quality potting soil with peat added and an orchid bark mix. Now the orchid bark mix will help to replicate the natural growing environment that it grows in, being that it's an epiphyte, it attaches itself to trees, so the roots naturally will be looking for bark to attach themselves to. So I've noticed growing in sphagnum moss, they will wrap themselves around sphagnum moss, but I think to replicate their natural behavior as closely as possible will produce a happier plant for you in the long run, because I've read blogs where people have kept Warocqueanum for many years, they've taken cuttings off of it, it's been happy as anything, and then all of a sudden it takes a turn for the worse. And in the blog that I actually read that from, the person had actually mentioned that they'd only ever grown the plant itself in sphagnum moss. So I I would suggest that there's a possibility that that might have had something to do with it, because a plant wants to be in its natural environment. If you change that in any particular way, of course there has to be a reaction to that. So adding that orchid bark mix into there just gives the root something to latch to, and also it helps to create that airy environment, because the bark is going to help make sure that it is pretty well draining, and it gives the root something to attach to. Also, on top of that, I would suggest to add potting charcoal and perlite to the mix. So what this will do is it will ensure that the potting medium is well draining, but has the ability to hold moisture without becoming soggy or waterlogged. Now, the reason I suggest that is, as you can imagine, being an epiphyte and its roots are attached to trees, the most it's ever going to get in terms of having water around it is going to be during rain. So it's never going to be sat in any kind of puddle, it's never going to be sat in a very damp environment for extended periods of time, and it's never going to be starved of oxygen. So to try and replicate that as closely as possible, I would suggest will aid in keeping a healthy plant. And as I mentioned, it can be quite touchy. Just things like shipping can affect this plant, and it can start showing you signs of being unhappy. So doing everything you can to keep it as happy as possible just means that you're going to have a plant for a long duration of time, and you're going to have a happy plant at that as well. So I would suggest that potting mix to be a good potting mix to start with. So when you receive your new cutting, add it to that potting mix, and then once you know that the roots have developed significantly, like for instance, give it the first growing season. So let's just say, for instance, you've received your plant in late March, you want to leave it in that medium through to the following year at the beginning of the growing season. Then when you're due to repot your plant, I would suggest to actually change that potting medium almost totally. So what I would suggest after that, so once a root system is established, I would transfer it from this potting medium to a potting mix of orchid bark mix and sphagnum moss. And what this will do, it will closely replicate its natural environment and give the roots something to attach themselves to for stability, whilst also adding sphagnum moss to that potting mix. Now you want to add the sphagnum moss at 40% to 60% orchid bark. The reason I say that is because just putting orchid bark in there, it can become quite compacted, and for the roots to be able to move around then becomes very difficult. So you want to make sure that you are creating an environment as close to its natural growing environment, but also giving the roots an opportunity to develop. So if you've just put them in a full orchid bark mix, you can imagine over the period of a year after watering and stuff like that, the orchid bark's going to move. It's then going to settle into the most compacted position, which is going to restrict movement for new root growth. So adding the sphagnum moss in means the roots can work their way through that sphagnum moss whilst attaching themselves to the orchid bark mix in that potting medium. So I think that those potting mediums personally would be the best way to replicate its natural growing environment. So if you can just imagine, we spend a lot of time trying to replicate natural growing environments by doing things like increasing humidity, especially if you're the kind of grower who keeps aeroids and things like philodendrons, anthuriums, and so on and so forth, then you're going to spend a lot of time and care and attention trying to replicate that environment as close as possible. It also would pay dividends to you to try and replicate the growing medium that it grows into, because getting every aspect of that, the plant's growth pattern as well as the environment that it grows in, as close as possible to that natural environment, will inevitably end up with you having a happier plant. So that's the reason I've gone into so much detail to explain to you why I've chosen the potting mix that I actually have. Now, just a quick description into why I chose the initial potting mix would be so that it does have an initial boost of nutrient as well, although it will be very slight. So adding that little bit of good quality potting mix means that there will be nutrients there when it needs to take them up, because just having sphagnum moss, unless you're going to add fertilizer to it, is pretty much void of any sort of fertilizer, unless it starts decomposing, bits of it start decomposing, and you know the plant's able to take some nutrients out of that. But other than that, it's pretty void of nutrients. So that is my potting mix, and that is my explanation as to why I chose to tell you to use that particular potting mix. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to temperature. Now I'm going to talk about temperature very briefly. No particular reason other than they're very basic parameters. Again, I didn't find any information online as to what temperature to actually keep the Warocqueanum at. So what I did again is I went back to check the temperatures in the rainforest during the growing season, which is what most of you are going to try and replicate in your house throughout the year. You know, you might have temperature fluctuations of a few degrees, but when we get winter, we switch the heating on. So, you know, it generally for a plant will never necessarily feel like winter, other than how much light is naturally being provided, which also you can replicate by adding grow lights to your environment and so on and so forth. So an ideal, from what I understand of the rainforest growing environment, the temperatures within that rainforest for optimal growth should be anywhere between 26 and 32 degrees Celsius during the day, and anywhere from 20 degrees to 26 degrees at night. So you've got your day to night fluctuation in there. So in the daytime you're looking at 26 to 32, and then at night 20 to 26. Those are optimal growing conditions. That doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, if in the daytime it goes slightly below 26 and you end up at 24 when the summer's coming to an end or just starting up, that it's going to have any adverse effects. It just, all it means is that you're outside of the optimum growing condition. So I wouldn't worry too much if you end up above slightly or slightly below those perimeters, providing you're not letting that fluctuation go too much. So those are the ideal temperatures for growing that plant. Next we're going to talk about watering. Again, it's going to be very briefly. There's not much to watering. As I mentioned earlier, the Anthurium Warocqueanum does not like a soggy or waterlogged environment. So after ensuring it has a well-draining substrate, make sure to keep the potting mix evenly moist. Because it comes from a rainforest, it does like a moist environment, but it will not like to be waterlogged. So when watering, make sure that you're watering it evenly, remove any excess runoff water, make sure that the potting medium is very freely draining. So if you're finding that water is collecting in that potting medium too much, maybe add a little bit more orchid bark or a little bit more perlite to it, so that it's retaining water but it's able to get rid of excess. And you should be fine from there. So as far as watering is concerned, you can use filtered water, you can use bottled water, or you can use rainwater. Generally, when watering all of my plants, I use filtered water. When watering your plants, make sure that you're watering at room temperature. If it's an emergency and you've noticed your plant actually needs watering and you've forgotten to water it and the substrate is bone dry and the plant seems to be sulking a little bit, don't just take your water straight out of a cold tap. Make sure that you're making it lukewarm, so as close to room temperature or above that as possible. The last thing you want to do is put cold water in, because it's going to send your plants into shock. could damage the roots and could inevitably damage the plant as well. So as I mentioned, with watering, use filtered water, rainwater or bottled water. Any of these are fine. Just make sure that you leave it for maybe up to 24 hours. Particularly if you're using filtered water or tap water if you don't have a filter, to give the water an opportunity to leach out any contaminants that are in that water that can be removed through evaporation by leaving the container open overnight. And also it's giving it an opportunity for that water to actually come up to room temperature. So that's how I water my plants there. That's the way of watering I would recommend to you. What we're going to do now is we're going to talk about humidity. Now, as you can imagine, the Anthurium Warocqueanum likes a high humid environment, so try to replicate this as closely as possible. The reason I say that is because coming from rainforests such as Colombia, the humidity levels within there are very high, and it can be very warm a lot of the time. Now, quite recently myself, I don't know if you can see it in the background, but I actually replaced the humidifier I was using. So the humidifier I used previously, it was absolutely fine. There was nothing wrong with it at all. The only thing that I found to be a little bit of a concern was that it was producing cold mist. It didn't have the option to produce warm mist. And with the temperatures dropping so low in England at the moment, especially during the night time, we're coming into a situation where we're going to have to soon start putting heating on in our house and so on and so forth. So even though you've got a humidifier running, putting heating on really dries out the air, which is really no good for your plant. Your average house humidity generally is about 45 to anywhere up to 50%, around about those parameters, and putting the heat on can really dry that humidity out for you. So rather than put the heating on, I thought I would try a humidifier that has an option to produce warm and hot steam. So since I've done that, it's increased the temperature within my house significantly, so much so that I'm not sure if I'm actually even going to have to put the heating on at all this year, because I keep my humidifiers running 24 hours a day. I still do use my other humidifier, but I use this humidifier in close proximity to where I do keep all my plants growing. So as I mentioned, to raise the humidity, you can use a humidifier. Another thing that you can do, which these plants will actually enjoy, is a regular misting. So get yourself a misting bottle and mist your plants on a regular basis. Anything from 3 times a week up to, you can do it every day, just making sure that you're not creating a soggy environment for them. So, you know, mist the leaves, don't mist, try not to be misting the soil too much, because you don't want a situation where, you know, you've got too much or excess moisture in the soil when you're just trying to create a humid environment for the leaves to be growing in. Other things you can do is you can get yourself a plant tray. You can get a bag of pebbles, like your general pebbles you get at the beach, and you can fill the plant tray with those pebbles, and then you can put all your pots on top of that plant tray, and you can half fill that plant tray with water. And what that will actually do is that water will evaporate around the plants, and that will create a natural humid environment for them. So it will raise the humidity in a more natural way for you. Another thing you can do, if you've got a lot of humidity loving plants, you can group them all together, and when you're misting the plant, it will create its own humid environment, so almost replicating an ecosystem of its own. So grouping those plants together, it will raise the humidity naturally for you without going into having to get pebble trays and, you know, relying on a humidifier if you haven't got one. So just grouping them together and giving them a good mist a few times a week will naturally raise that humidity around the plants. I think I've covered enough there as far as humidity is concerned. So what I'm going to do now, and very briefly, is I'm going to talk about fertilization of this plant. Now, again, there was absolutely no information on the internet concerning how much you should fertilize this particular plant. There was plenty of information about anthuriums, but anthuriums as a species, I think, is too generalized. So again, I went back to looking at how the plant grows. Due to the fact it's an epiphyte, it grows on the trunks of trees or branches coming off of those trunks. So nutrients going to be very slim for the plant. So as you can imagine, when the rain comes, that's carrying nutrients. As that rain's falling, it's running down the bark of the tree, and the little nooks and crannies in that bark, any trace elements or anything are going to get, you know, deposited in those nooks and crannies, and then the plant's roots are going to take it up from there. So as you can imagine, there's not a ready source, or there's not excessive amounts of nutrient for it to be taken up. So what you don't want to do is create a situation where you've got too much fertilizer in its growing medium. So what I would actually suggest is that a general houseplant fertilizer, a balanced houseplant fertilizer, will be ideal. And what you actually want to do is you want to use it at a quarter to less. Don't try and feed it more than the quarter dilution rate from the recommended dose on the bottle, because as I mentioned, as you can imagine, being that its roots are quite exposed, it's not, you know, in a situation where it's on the forest floor and, you know, there's lots of decaying matter around, and the soil's being replenished with that decaying matter, so nutrients are readily available due to the fact that it's an epiphyte and it grows on a tree and its roots are generally exposed to the elements. It's never going to be sitting in a situation where it's surrounded by nutrients. So I would suggest a quarter dilution rate. So if it says 10 ml to every litre, I would say 2.5 ml to every litre or less, and add that nutrient once every 4 waterings. So water it with your filtered rain or bottled water 3 times with no nutrients added, and then finally on your 4th watering, add that nutrient to your watering regime, making sure that you're doing it at a very, very diluted rate in comparison to what the manufacturer recommends, keeping in mind that the growing environment for this naturally dictates that it's not in a rich nutrient environment anyway. Okay, so that's the fertilizer. Now what I'm going to do briefly is I'm going to talk about a couple of rescues that I've done for the Anthurium Warocqueanum when plants have arrived to me previously, and the plant itself has pretty much been dead, and I've had to revive those plants just from stumps because the roots have actually died, the leaves have died, the stems have died. The only thing that's showing any signs of life is the actual body of the plant itself, which still has some green in it. So for those of you who are having plants shipped from abroad and they're turning up like that, and you know you're receiving your plant and you're thinking, oh my god, this is pretty much dead, is there anything I can do? There is something that you can do. So what I've actually done with 2 of my queen anthuriums that turned up pretty much dead is I removed all the decaying matter from the plants, and I put sphagnum moss into a Ziploc bag. I then put that stump into that Ziploc bag. I blew the bag up like a balloon, as you can see here. I put it in my green wall behind some of the plants so that it's getting filtered light, and I just left it there for a few months, every now and then just checking to make sure that the bag hadn't deflated too much, and if it had, I would only ever open it to put more air into it, otherwise generally it stayed closed. So I put 2 queen anthuriums into separate Ziploc bags, I filled the bottom up with sphagnum moss. I made sure that the sphagnum moss was moist enough to create a mist on the Ziploc bag, but moist enough for that mist to clear by 10-11 o'clock in the morning, so not overly moist. And then I left them in there, and this is the second of the two. The first one I actually sold to a person who follows me on Instagram quite recently, and it was doing absolutely brilliantly. I mean, the leaf looked just perfect. It was beautiful, and it had recovered so well. And this is the other one, and I don't know if you can see, but actually in there is a fully emerged leaf. It has a rooting system which is just here in front. I don't know if you'll be able to see it in the video, but there's a white root that's emerged and worked its way down into the sphagnum moss, and there are actually 3 other leaves growing or emerging in there at present as well. So this plant is actually producing 4 leaves at the moment. So if you end up in a situation where your Warocqueanum has suffered a little bit and it's started to lose its leaves, or its roots are dying because it's been in too moist an environment, or anything that seems to be going wrong with it, and it's at the point where you possibly are going to lose that plant, then I would definitely suggest to give this method a try, because it has worked for me and it has worked really, really well for me. So I'm pretty much done there. I hope that there's been enough information in this video, because as I mentioned, there was absolutely nothing online. If I've missed anything and there's anything else that you do want to know about the Warocqueanum, don't hesitate to contact me. I'll be happy to answer any questions that I'm able to find an answer to. Thank you everyone for your support. If you're new to my channel, please don't forget to subscribe. If you've enjoyed today's video, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button. I really enjoy reading your comments, so please don't forget to comment. I like being able to interact with the people who are watching my videos. For any of you who are new to my channel and are unaware, I also run an Instagram page, and generally most of my videos that I do come through Instagram. So what I generally will do is I'll put up a vote, and I will ask people what video they would like to see, and usually I'll put 3 or 4 different plants to choose from, and whichever plant gets picked the most, I will choose that plant and we'll do a video on that plant. The reason I chose to do a video on the Anthurium Warocqueanum today is mainly due to the fact that I've had quite a lot of requests from people who have just contacted me privately saying, are you able to do a video on this plant? You know, we'd really like some information, mainly due to the fact that there's none really available. So I had enough requests, I had a few in stock, so I thought it's an ideal opportunity for those people who are looking for that information to actually have a video to go and watch, so that they can feel a little bit more confident owning this kind of plant. So thank you all for tuning in again if you're returning to my channel, and if you're new to my channel, again, like I said, don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for tuning into my channel today. I've really enjoyed making this video. It was a bit of a challenge, and I do enjoy a challenge because as I've mentioned several times now, there was literally no information about this online. For those of you who don't know, I have actually started a business quite recently as well. I've registered as a limited company. I sell plants. My internet website is, my online store rather, is almost finished now. I plan on actually going next Monday to meet the developers to see if we can approve everything that's been done so that we can just get started. I plan on opening my shop no later than the 1st of January. In the meanwhile, I do sell all my plants through Instagram, so if you are looking for something, please feel free to come through to my Instagram account, which is also plants and paints, so plants_and_paints, and you will see my recent plant hauls on there. You can also see my plant haul video that I did quite recently here, which I think was 60 plants. Because I received such a good response to that, I've actually got another plant haul on the way. Generally I never did plant hauls, So I'm actually going to record another plant haul. My plants are due in towards the end of next week to early the following week, and I think I've got about 70 plants coming this time around, and some quite different things to what I had in my last purchase. So don't forget to tune into that plant haul as well. I look forward to filming that for you. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I've enjoyed making today's video. My name's Zahir. This is Plants and Paints, and I'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye bye.